In this presentation, we'll look at some of the art of the Romantic era. So we're looking at the 1800s. And really we can look at the picture on this slide as an example of one of the main elements of Romanticism, which was the emphasis on nature. If you look at this picture, what is emphasized, and it's the scenery and the sky and the water, and what is absent is any human figures. So one element of Romantic painting would be glorifying the wildness and the vastness of nature. This is a very famous painting called The Haywain by John Constable. It's reproduced so often it starts to our modern eyes to almost look like calendar art, but at the time it was greatly admired. It was seen as a fresh and new approach to painting. Here's a cloud study by Constable. He was clearly a Romantic artist, and if you look at his dates, he's clearly in the Romantic era. But he would go out frequently just to capture the changing sky, the light in the sky, and as such was an influence on the Impressionists who were going to come at the end of the 19th century. But he sort of foreshadowed that development by focusing on the aspect of the sky. Here's another one of his studies where he's looking at a rain cloud. The quote on this slide is from a critic at the time. The atmosphere possesses a characteristic humidity about it that almost imparts the wish for an umbrella. So he's just talking about how effective this is at capturing that moment in nature. Another feature of Romantic painting would be an intensely expressive style. We've looked in this class briefly at the execution of the Citizens of Madrid, which is featured on this slide. It was painted by Francisco Goya. Much like Beethoven in music, Goya worked through the transition from the neoclassical era to the Romantic era. But he's a very interesting figure. He worked for the court of Charles IV. That was the actual Spanish court that was in power when Napoleon Bonaparte came to power. And then in the early 1800s, Napoleon and his troops came into Spain under the guise of the idea of invading Portugal. But in fact, they did not invade Portugal. They usurped the Spanish throne, and Napoleon put his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. The years that followed were intensely violent and bloody conflict as the French executed those Spaniards throughout the country who participated in uprising, and that's what this execution of the Citizens of Madrid is based on. But this kind of intensely expressive painting is typically Romantic. Another style of dramatic Romantic painting was historical painting. This is by Eugène Delacroix, and it's depicting the horror of a historic event when the Greeks were rebelling for independence against the Ottoman Empire. And you can see that in the foreground there are dead and dying Greeks and two Turkish soldiers who are continuing to attack them. In the middle ground you can see another group in conflict, and in the distance there's actually a village burning. So this is another kind of that intense Romantic art. This painting, Olympia by Manet, emphasizes the freedom from convention that Romantic painters were seeking. When we first talked about continuity and transformation, you'll remember that we looked at a painting called Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe with two clothed men and one nymph-like draped female figure in the back and then one nude figure at the front looking out at us. Similarly, here in Olympia, we have a nude female figure who is not a goddess, but rather, in fact, a Parisian courtesan in her bedroom. So those classical references, the idea of Greek gods and goddesses justifying this kind of portrayal, is gone, and it's a departure from those conventions. I want to look at one American school. Very often we have been talking about the European tradition. There was a beautiful tradition around this time in America, a group of painters who were called the Hudson School, and they focused on trying to capture light in their painting. So this is a beautiful example of Along the Hudson by Alfred Thomas Britcher from Boston. And he's a largely self-taught artist, but he definitely captures that light. Here's another example of American Romantic painting by Bierstadt, the Rocky Mountains, and you can see how he captures the light on the water and also the distant light. Now, there's, as always, with this idea of a pendulum swinging, some artists became dissatisfied with the exotic, escapist tendencies of Romanticism, and the idea of realism gained traction in the art world. One of the proponents of realism was Gustave Courbet. This painting is meant to be somewhat allegorical of a meeting between Courbet and his patron, Bruyas. And the idea there is that there's a artistic and financial pact as they exchange payment for art. But in the painting, it's interesting because actually it is the painter wearing the backpack who appears to be a more proud and haughty individual. This painting was rejected from the official salon in 1855, but Courbet would not sway from his idea of realism. Not exactly part of realism, but part of that same idea of artists sort of proclaiming a certain status and independence for themselves is this cartoon by Daumier called The Freedom of the Press. This is actually a lithograph, not a painting, obviously, but it portrays the center figure here is portraying a printer as a symbol of free ideas, and in the background you see on the right Charles X and his ministers who have been sort of, you could say, knocked down in the revolution, and then on the left you see Louis Philippe sort of gesturing threateningly at the printer, but the printer stands very strong as a representative of freedom of ideas and freedom of thought. Actually, Daumier spent some time in prison as a result of this print, and it is a good example of how art can exert a certain influence and power in the world. Daumier was, maybe you could say, the father of the political cartoon, and this is a early example of that kind of use of art. Another realist was Rosa Bonheur. She was someone who went about twice a week dressed as a man to the horse market so that she could really examine her subject matter, and you can see that kind of study in the detail and accuracy of her painting. In music, some of the same ideas were in play. They get a slightly different, they're revealed in a slightly different way in the medium of music. Spontaneity replaced control, and long lyrical melodies became very prominent, very important in Romantic music. I should mention that Romantic as an era doesn't have anything to do with romantic love as we think of it between two people who are in love. Rather, romantic just means that the artwork is intended to convey a feeling or an atmosphere rather than a rational idea. Some other features of Romantic music would be more irregular rhythms and meters. Sometimes it's actually hard to tell where the beat is. The harmonies are increasingly complex, and there's more dissonance as we continue through the Romantic era and beyond Romantic era too. And another really important element of the romantic music would be the greatly expanded tone colors. The orchestra is getting bigger. It can be sometimes more than 100 people in the biggest romantic works. Extended technique refers to asking instrumentalists to do things that previously hadn't been done. New kinds of pizzicato, new kinds of bow strokes, new kinds of mutes, and actually even new kinds of instruments as the dynamic range and the tonal range expand. One master of the Romantic era is Johannes Brahms. He wrote absolute music. That means his music did not have a program. It was not necessarily telling a story, but it certainly is intensely expressive, which is typical of Romantic art. His orchestration was beautiful. His rhythm was often complex. He would do what's called displacing the beat, where your ear starts to hear the strongest beat of the measure somewhere where it doesn't actually belong, and that creates a certain tension in his music. Now, Brahms had a lifelong relationship with the Schumann family, and when Felix Schumann died, he was a young man, and it was a terribly sad moment for the Schumann family, but also for Brahms himself. He wrote a violin sonata shortly after the death of this young friend, and he, for the fourth movement, the fourth section of this sonata, used the same music as a song in which the singer describes crying in a melancholy mood, and then the words that you see on this slide, after that sad time has passed, when the sun shines again, the grass is doubly green, and doubly on my cheeks glow my burning tears. So it's kind of putting together the idea of tears and rain. And this violin sonata has no words, obviously, it's for violin and piano, but it tells us that he was thinking of rain and tears when he wrote it. Now, that example is included in the music examples on D2L, but you can hear a little bit of it here. And the idea of rain is portrayed in the piano part. You can hear these little continuous notes like raindrops. And one other thing to mention about that sonata is that Felix Schumann, the young man who died, was himself a violinist, which makes it a little more poignant that the work was for violin and piano. This example is from Romantic opera. It's from the opera Tosca, which tells the story of her love for the painter Cavaradossi. And the big conflict or tragedy really in that opera is the existence of Scarpia, who is a truly twisted and evil person who thwarts their marriage. And actually in the end, both Tosca and Cavaradossi are dead at the end of the opera. But the music is just heartbreakingly beautiful through much of the story. And this excerpt I'll post on D2L so that you can watch it. But it's the portion of the opera where Cavaradossi believes that he's about to be executed. He is, in fact, about to be executed. And he's singing about his life up until that point. It's very, very beautiful music. And the last thing that we'll look at in this presentation is Romantic ballet. So we know that ballet was institutionalized and really made important in the French court some years earlier. In Romantic ballet, we have fully developed classical ballet techniques. So point and turnout are all established. And perhaps what really distinguishes Romantic ballet from earlier ballet is its focus on telling a story. Very often it's telling a fairy tale. In the example that I'll post on D2L, it is a typical fairy tale in a way, in that it's doomed love, a favorite of the Romantic era. The name of the ballet that you'll be watching an excerpt from is La Sylphide. It's set in Scotland, and the James and the sylph fall in love. So the sylph falls in love with the Scot. He is supposed to be getting married that day. He deserts his fiancée to run off with the sylph. But a witch sees what's happening and gives him an enchanted scarf. And once he puts it around the sylph, she goes off to sylph's heaven. So it's just a terrible story of this sort of doomed love, and yet it has all these magical, wonderful things to portray visually and in dance. So you can look at that clip on D2L, and that will be your exposure to Romantic ballet.